Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Very, very much appreciated. Seems like the long row episode got a lot of views, which is quite nice. Lots of comments across various social media platforms that I post it to, and even though one of the samples may or may not have actually been the 14-year-old sherry, it still seemed to sort of generate an awful lot of conversation, which is good, which is cool. It's what I hope that these episodes of the show do. It's not just about me sitting here pontificating at the end of the day. I do like a bit of social interaction, as they say. So yes, even though that, like I said, Ian pointed out that sample may have been mislabeled for a Bartles Speyside, I think he said, and I do remember him giving me a sample of that possibly around about the same sort of time, so it's entirely possible. These things happen from time to time, but anyway, like I said, I don't think it marred the show in any way. But anyway, that was last week. On to this week. As I may have mentioned a few weeks ago, I was doing some box rummaging, and I pulled out a number of samples which I thought, oh yeah, I really want to show those and do an episode of the show on that, and put together a number of groupings, shall we say, some of which I've obviously done already, and this is another one of them. It's as you can see, an indie Bowmore episode of the show. Hunter Laing and Douglas Laing, that's what I had to hand, I suppose, and it kind of, this is going to be an episode of the show that won't be repeated. I'm never going to get the opportunity to do another independent Bowmore bottling episode of the show, because frankly I haven't seen an independently bottled Bowmore in years, absolute years. If you go back, when I was first getting into the whiskey industry, well over 20 years ago now. God, bloody hell, that makes me feel old. Independent bottlings of Bowmore were pretty, well, yeah, they were fairly ubiquitous. They came out regularly, different age statements, that kind of thing. They were affordable, if memory serves me correct, and obviously, like a number of distilleries, they stopped selling into the secondary market. The casks dried up, and we're in the situation now, which I've said many, many times, that there's only a limited gene pool for independents to purchase, basically. Which is sad, but like I said, this is an episode of the show which I'll probably never have the opportunity to repeat. So I thought, well, let's do it now. While we're kind of talking about Bowmore, I've always loved Bowmore. I remember the first time I tasted Bowmore, it was kind of like, whoa, I just loved the smoky intensity, the sort of like, it put hairs on your chest. It was it was wild, it was smoky, and obviously back then I was somewhat, shall we say, naive, and I frankly didn't know jack at the end of the day, but to me the old 17 was just a lovely whiskey. It just had the right amount of maturity, the right amount of that smoky Bowmore character, and unfortunately a few years later, I think of 2009, I think, about that sort of time, they replaced the 17 with the current 18-year-old, and things kind of seemed to me to take a slightly different turn. To be bluntly honest with you, Bowmore became very polite. It seemed to me that not only the 18 had a vast amount of oak. Prior to that, I remember the 12 and the 17, I would have guessed predominantly sort of refill American oaks, not a huge amount of oak character, a bit like Kalila, all about the spirit, and then suddenly out comes the 18, which is kind of almost swamped with first fill American oak. It was kind of like, licking sort of butter and stuff, and the 12-year-old seemed to lose its way as well. It seemed to become sort of, less of this hairy-chested beastie, and just became rather too polite for my personal taste. Now, of course, you may argue with that, but to me, as we know, distilleries do change over the years. Sometimes it is accidental, I suppose, the sort of casks that they can get hold of and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes it's by design. This I don't know whether it was done that way. whether it was by design or just purely accidental, the fact that they were using or having access to more first or virgin or first fill American oak casks, whereas prior to that they'd been sort of rummaging around for whatever they could get their hands on used wise. Who knows? But anyway, to me, sort of Bowmore changed for the worst. You know, it just wasn't what I remember it to be, which was a bit of a shame. But anyway, we're not talking about the distillery releases. We're doing this episode of the show, and obviously I had to sort of work with what I've got, which is what I've got. And you know, I think it's a nice enough spread of age statements, so don't really need to say an inordinate amount really about Bowmore, because I have done episodes of the show on Bowmore in the past. Although the last one was, I can't even remember when the last one was. You know, too much whiskey kind of like addles the memory, as they say. So anyway, let's just take a look at today's lineup. Terrible secret. It's tearing me apart. Right, okay, so all these date back to a time when both Hunter Laing and Douglas Laing sent out regular monthly boxes, which was really cool. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen anymore. So, but even if it did, I mean, they wouldn't be sort of releasing this stuff anymore. So we're going to kick off with a 10-year-old. This is a Douglas McGibbon Provenance 10-year-old. It's a single refill bourbon hogshead, DMG 9574, distilled in December of 2002 and bottled in May of 2013. Then we're going to move on to a 15-year-old. This was bottled in Douglas Laing's Old Particular range. It's a single sherry butt, DL 10794, distilled in May of 2000 and bottled in June of 2015 at 48.4%. The Douglas McGibbon bottling was bottled at 46%. The third bottling we'll be looking at is a 17-year-old, again in the Douglas Laing Old Particular range. It is again a sherry butt, the single sherry butt, DL 11007, distilled in June of 1998 and bottled in December of 2015, again at 48.4%. Then we're going to move on to two 20-year-olds bottled by Hunter Laing in the Old Malt Cask range. So the first one is a single bourbon, refill bourbon hoggy, HL 13301, distilled in September of 1996 and bottled in February of 2017. The second one was bottled exactly the same time, so I'm guessing the cask, and it's again from September 1996, probably part of a batch that they purchased, I would imagine, from Bowmore. Again, a refill bourbon hoggy, HL 13284. And the final bottling of the day is another 20-year-old, this time in Douglas Laing's Old Particular range, again from 1996, although this was distilled in December of 1996. Again, probably could have come from the same batch, I would have thought. Obviously, as you probably remember, once upon a time Douglas Laing was one company, and then obviously they split and formed Hunter Laing and what have you, and obviously Hunter Laing took a number of casks and things like that. So I would imagine, like I said, this was probably part of the same batch of casks. So this was DL 11590, like I said, distilled in December of 1996, bottled in March of 2017 at 51.5%. So like I said, I think a nice spread of ages, different cask types, you know, fairly straightforward, you know, American oak sherry, none of your bloody wine casks and stuff, or Devil's Doogies, or whatever the bloody one was that Bowmore release that was, well, enough said. Anyway, we're not, like I said, we're not talking about the distillery, we're going to have a look at these, so let's crack on. Right, okay, so let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? This is the 10-year-old Douglas McGibbon Provenance bottling. Quite oily, quite a bit of oak, quite sort of caramelled, sort of fleshy, apricot, bog myrtle, a little bit of menthol. It kind of, it's kind of like a precursor to how the sort of 12-year-old eventually became. It was this more overt oak character, which kind of, although there's a bit of peat reek, there's a bit of rubber, there's some summer flowers, it's just a little bit polite, really. It's not, it's lacking that kind of, you know, herbal, windswept, salty intensity that just was just said Bowmore to me, you know. It's nice, and it certainly comes across more like a first fill cask than a refill cask. So possibly, obviously a very active refill cask. Anyway, let's see what passes on. Again, quite oaky to start off with. Again, lots of that sort of fudge, caramel, toffee, fleshy fruit, apricot, a little bit of barley, touch of smoke coming through on the mid palate, and then the kind of oak runs out of steam, and voila, there you get a bit of that sort of intense, salty coastal Bowmore character and that sort of sootiness. Overall, the finish was great. Loved the finish because basically the oak just went, oh, okay, I'm giving up, and just allowed the Bowmore character to sort of finally come through on the end. Up until that point, it was all, like I said, all fairly safe, fairly nice, bit too oaky, but yeah, good starter, I think.
Crushing my will to live like
Right, okay, so let's move on to the Douglas Laing Old Particular 15-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Okay, it's not the cleanest of sherry butts I've come across. There is a little bit of a sulphur blemish. There's sort of burnt butter, sort of singed sherried herbal fruit, a little bit of peat, not a great deal of peat. It's, again, I wouldn't go as far as saying polite. It's a bit rough. Now, if it had the sort of, like, you know, real smoky intensity of that Bowmore was famous for, that little bit of roughness would have probably either, you know, worked in with the smoke or practically been covered by it. But because it doesn't have that sort of smoky intensity, it's kind of leaving that sort of blemish kind of, you know, to sort of just be too noticeable. Anyway, let's see what passes on. Yeah, that blemish is really coming through on the finish. It kind of bookends it, unfortunately. Kind of kicks off with the sulphur. I mean, partially it's my fault. My palate does pick up sulphur quite easily, which is I don't know whether you'd call that a blessing or a curse, to be bluntly honest with you. And so it kind of bookends it, and it gets really quite bitter and astringent on the finish. And you have this portion in the mid palate where it's all quite really pleasant, you know, rubbery, tarry, sooty, sherry dried fruits, but that's all a little bit brief, and then we kind of come back to the sort of bitter sort of sulphur blemish on the finish. It's a bit of a shame because I think that was shaping up to be quite a good whiskey, but this is often the problem with you know, sherry butts from 20 odd years ago. The quality was so much, well, I mean, it was less variable than it was sort of, you know, from stuff that was distilled back in the 80s. I mean, certainly I've said it many times, but you know, 80s distilled Bunnahabhain, oh mother, you really don't want to go there. But anyways, it wasn't as bad as that, but it wasn't great. Right, okay, so let's move on to the old particular 17-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end. Another sherry butt. Okay, so this is clean, no sulphur blemish. So just obviously distilled a couple of years prior to that, and it's it's more like sort of old school Bowmore. It has that classic sooty, dusty, almost spicy character. A little bit of violet, quite fragrant. The sherry is subtle. So I'm guessing sort of fairly refill sherry, but this is obviously not for, well, you can tell by the colour it's certainly not first fill sherry, but there's a little bit of barbecued meat, a little bit of sherry, dried fruit. Yeah, it's a good whiskey. It's a lovely whiskey. It again doesn't quite have the sort of like, you know, that overt smoky hairs on your chest Bowmore character. But it's definitely there underneath a little bit of sherry, if you see what I mean. And it goes to show you how much influence a sherry cask can have, or how much influence a cask full stop can have on the spirit. Anyway, let's see what that's like. That's a good palate. Oh, it's got this lovely violety note on the finish. Again, not too heavy on the sherry. A little bit of dried fruit, which does just kind of take the edge off the sort of wildness of the spirit, although it's got a lovely maturity. It's elegant. It's got, you know, dusty peat smoke, violets, barley, touch of almost kind of sort of licoricey tar. It's kind of, somewhere between the 2 points. A little bit of coastal notes, some nice dusty peat again. Yeah, I mean, that was a good sherried Bowmore, it has to be said. Not too sherried, and enough of that sort of smoky Bowmore character just to sort of like go.
Like a gravel backpack, or a dream and shall grow in.
Right, okay, so on to the first of the 2 Hunter Laing Old Malt Cask bottlings. So this is obviously 20 years old, distilled in September of 1996. Let's see what the nose goes on this then, shall we? This is just showing the... Okay, so there's not a lot of oak, so I'm getting very much the citric side of Bowmore, which is an element that often gets overlooked, that I remember quite adamantly from the old 12-year-old. It's not a huge amount of peat. It's very peatless, to be almost honest with you. It's got some milky, sawdusty oak, a little bit of burnt wood, a touch of oxidised fruit, some barley, a little bit of fish. That's a nice nose. I mean, it's showing how citric the Bowmore spirit actually is once you take away a large chunk of the peat. Now, either the barley that was used in this particular run wasn't particularly heavily peated, or the peat is just, you know, as we often, I mean, it's always that kind of question, isn't it? Does the peat character drop off and dissipate over time, or does it become more subservient to the oak? Always a good question. Certainly in this, you could argue the toss either way on this. I mean, although the oak isn't too intense and too heavy, it is a little bit more noticeable than the peat. The peat is not, it's dropped off, you know. But it's, like I say, it's lovely. It allows the sort of citric character of the spirit to come through. Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. Again, quite citric, barley. I'm getting that violety note, which is a note that I often got with Bowmore, and incidentally I used to get it on Port Ellen as well. That sort of, it sometimes varies between sort of light violets and midnight violets. It's got a not quite gristiness, but again, lovely barley character, wispy smoke, not a great deal of peat, little bit of oak. It's beautiful, beautiful spirit. It just showed you the quality of the spirit that flows from Bowmore when you're not sort of like, you know, sticking copious amounts of oak over the top of it. It shows that the spirit itself is absolutely gorgeous, and by, like I said, by removing some of that peat character, it kind of like removes the peat distraction, if you like, and it's a bit like sort of unpeated Kalila. You suddenly go, ooh, it's actually a bit more than just peat. And I think that particular bottling absolutely proved that the spirit that Bowmore is producing, and probably still is, although I've not tasted it in donkey's years, bloody good.
This is the way we live our lives.
Right, okay, so let's move on to its sister cask, distilled at exactly the same time, bottled at the same time. Is it going to be completely different, or is it going to be the same? Let's have a look. Completely different, and this is the lovely thing about single casks. These may well have even matured side by side in the warehouse, who knows. So this is more phenolic, more briny. Again, there's that citric note that sort of like is definitely noticeable. More peat, more coastal, possibly not quite as complex in actual fact, but the coastal, almost wild Bowmore character is just coming through in absolute spades. As wild as a 20-year-old could be, that is. Completely different. Almost getting a touch of bog myrtle now. We're almost kind of moving into a sort of Kalila-y kind of direction. Yeah, it's less smoky, and certainly more phenolic, and briny and citric. Good nose. Let's see what the pass on. Fuller, chunkier, oilier, fishier, more peat. Like I said, it's got that more kind of astringent coastal peat character, not quite as sooty as you would expect. Finish is gorgeous. I mean, it really is. That citric note is kind of coming through. There's a little bit of barley, some tar. Again, not a great deal of oak. So this is kind of, this reminds me of sort of Bowmore from, or certainly from the early 2000s when I was first tasted it. It's got that lovely intensity of character, maybe not quite so sooty and quite so wild and woolly as say the 12-year-old, but then it's a 20-year-old. But I'm not getting that sort of overt, sort of sawdusty oak kind of character. The oak is pretty much non-existent. It's kind of, I can sense some tannins and some structure being added by the oak, but you're not getting any real vanillins or sawdust or anything like that. So it's all about the spirit character, and the spirit character is good. Right, okay, so on to the final 20-year-old. So this was distilled a couple of months later, so this was distilled in December of 1996. Let's see what the nose gives on this then, shall we? Kind of somewhere between the two of them, to be honest with you, or the previous two. There's plenty of coastal character, but there's quite a lot of oak as well. Sweet, vanilla, dried fruit, violets, a little bit more medicinal peat than overtly sort of sooty peat character. A little bit of seaweed, some smoke, some brine. Again, an absolutely gorgeous nose. A little bit more oak, but we're not talking mountains of oak. Yeah, let's see what that's like. That's right. We're certainly in the same kind of ballpark as the previous two. Wonderfully citric. Again, not a huge amount of oak on the palate, so we're not getting all that kind of dusty, sawdusty, vanilla kind of character. We're all talking about the wonderful citric spirit. The peat, again, is quite delicate and gentle. A little sooty, it has to be said. There's some seaweed, there's a little bit of medicinal bog myrtle, there's some almost kind of gingery kind of spices there just on the aftertaste. There's a little bit of a darker kind of malt character right on the very end of the finish. wonderful progression, stunning whiskey, it has to be said. And like I said, with the other two 20-year-olds, an absolute testament to the quality of the spirit that's produced at Bowmore. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Firstly, a big thank you to both Hunter Laing and Douglas Laing for the samples for today's episode of the show, although they were sent absolutely eons and eons ago. But again, a big thank you to them for those samples. So, yeah, I loved it. I mean, it's been the first time I've tasted those three 20-year-olds together in one place, and like I said, it just shows you that the quality of the spirit that Bowmore is producing. Okay, they maybe didn't have the wildness, the woolliness that I remember of the old 12-year-old, but then, you know, they are 20, you know, so, but the 10-year-old, the Douglas McGibbon Provenance, like I said, that kind of remind me more of where sort of like the 12-year-old and the 18-year-old is at this present moment in time. More oak character, a little bit sort of soft, and I wouldn't quite go saying soft and fluffy, but certainly lacking the sort of like, you know, that intensity of spirit character. But, you know, you kind of, you know, a lot of people have probably grown up with Bowmore like that and don't remember, or have never come across Bowmore as it sort of probably once was. The 15-year-old sherry bottling. It's a shame that there was a sulphur blemish there, and it certainly really marred the palate. It kind of almost bookended the palate with the sulphur, and then there was a moment of clarity in the middle there, where it was like, oh, this could have been a really good cask, but unfortunately the sulphur had its way with it. Unlike the 17, which was as clean as a whistle and really quite pleasant, and it seems to date back to a bygone era of when the sherry was a little bit more refilled. The casks had been used a few more times, and you know, you weren't sort of, you know, battling against all that sort of raisinade fruit and what have you. And it had character. It had wood, and it had, you know, distillery character. So you can't argue for more than that. And then I kind of like really sum up the three 20-year-olds altogether, because they were very much within a sort of a similar kind of style. Obviously, the two Hunter Laing bottlings that were sort of from the same distillation were actually quite surprisingly different, and it just shows you how what happens in maturation, and it's not a precise science. You know, here we had sort of like the first bottling where the peat had almost practically disappeared. The second bottling, there was still plenty of peat there. Again, it showed that old Bowmore from back then was using more refilled casks, less active casks, more about the spirit and less about the overt oak character, which to me was pretty damn good. I mean, admittedly, I love some old sawdusty American oak like the next man, but sometimes, you know, it's just sort of dial back the oak and just you know, indulge in great quality spirit. And certainly Bowmore bottles or distills great quality spirit at the end of the day. So there you go. Probably, like I said, this will probably never be repeated again, this particular episode, because I'm not going to get these kind of samples ever again. So it's been a blast. So until next week, all that's left to say is good afternoon and good ramming. Actually, there's nothing in there.